Stand on the walls of York today, and you can trace a circuit of limestone and red brick that has enclosed this city for 2,000 years. More than 4 million tourists walk these ramparts each year, photographing the Minster's Gothic towers and the narrow medieval streets below. But rewind 19 centuries, and you would have found a Roman fortress rising from marshland where two rivers met. Timber palisades, legionary barracks, and the northernmost edge of an empire that stretched to the Sahara. Conquest, plague, fire, resurrection. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every century of York's story. From the day Quintus Petillius Cerialis planted the 9th Legion standard in AD 71, to the railway boom that transformed a medieval backwater into England's northern capital, to the walls and gates you can visit today. This is the city where Constantine was proclaimed emperor, where Vikings forged a kingdom, where medieval England's richest archbishops built a cathedral that took 2.5 centuries to complete, a fortress that became a capital that survived the dissolution, the Civil War, and the Blitz. The entire history of York, every invasion, every fire, every reinvention, in 32 minutes. The River Ouse has always been York's reason for existence. In AD 71, the Roman general Quintus Petillius Cerialis led the 9th Legion, the Legio IX Hispana, north from Lincoln into Brigantian territory, pursuing the remnants of Venutius's rebellion. Where the Ouse met the smaller River Fosse, Cerialis found a gravel plateau elevated just enough above the floodplain to support a fortress. He ordered his engineers to build. The first Eboracum was timber and turf. 5,000 legionaries dug a rectangular enclosure covering 50 acres, raising ramparts 12 feet high and cutting ditches 20 feet wide. The fortress's Principia, headquarters building, sat at the intersection of the Via Praetoria and Via Principalis, a grid pattern that Roman military engineers replicated from Hadrian's Wall to the Danube. By AD 107, the timber had been replaced with limestone, quarried from Tadcaster, 6 miles southwest. Eboracum's walls now stood 15 feet thick at the base, faced with massive ashlar blocks that still form the foundation of York's medieval defenses. The fortress became a city. A civilian settlement, the Canabae Legionis, spread beyond the southwest gate, housing merchants, tavern keepers, blacksmiths, and the families of serving soldiers. By the early 2nd century, Eboracum's population had swelled to perhaps 10,000. The fortress minted coins, operated bathhouses fed by aqueducts, and imported wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, and garum from Lusitania. In AD 211, the Emperor Septimius Severus died in Eboracum after campaigning in Caledonia. His son Caracalla assumed the purple in the fortress's praetorium, making York the birthplace of an emperor's reign. But the most consequential imperial proclamation came a century later. On July 25, AD 306, Constantine the Great was declared Augustus by the legions in Eboracum, 6 hours after his father Constantius Chlorus expired in the fortress. The young Constantine would march south, defeat Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, convert to Christianity, and reshape the Roman world. York had produced the emperor who made Christianity the empire's faith. For 4th century Eboracum, this was Zenith, a walled city of basilicas and temples, the administrative capital of Britannia Inferior, home to the 6th Legion and a thriving Romanized population. Then Rome withdrew. The year AD 410 marks the traditional end of Roman Britain. The Emperor Honorius told the Civitates to look to their own defenses. In Eboracum, the legions departed. The aqueducts crumbled. The basilica's roof collapsed. For nearly 2 centuries, the archaeological record goes almost silent. We have no coins, no inscriptions, no building phases. The city's population may have contracted to a few hundred souls squatting in the ruins of Roman stone. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offers only fragments. Sometime in the mid-5th century, Anglian settlers moved into the valleys of the Ouse and the Derwent. They called the old Roman fortress Eoforwic, the Boer settlement. The revival came through Christianity. In AD 601, Pope Gregory the Great dispatched Augustine to convert the English. By 627, King Edwin of Northumbria, the most powerful Anglo-Saxon ruler in Britain, was baptized in York by Paulinus. a missionary sent north from Canterbury. Paulinus became the first bishop of York, and Edwin ordered the construction of a wooden church on the site of the old Roman Principia. The church was small, timber-framed, dedicated to St. Peter. But it was the seed from which York Minster would grow. Northumbria's golden age arrived in the 7th and 8th centuries. York became the intellectual capital of Anglo-Saxon England. The monk scholar Alcuin of York, born around 735, ran the cathedral school and corresponded with Charlemagne, eventually becoming master of the palace school in Aachen. Alcuin's library in York was among the finest in Europe, manuscripts of Virgil, Cicero, Pliny, Bede. The city minted coins again. Its archbishop, Ecgberht, received the pallium from Rome in 735, elevating York to an archbishopric equal in rank to Canterbury. Eoforwic's population climbed back toward 5,000. Stone churches rose within the old Roman walls. Then the dragon ships came. On November 1st, 866, the Great Heathen Army, a Viking coalition led by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, captured York. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the siege in terse detail. The Northumbrian kings Illa and Osbert counterattacked on March 21st, 867, breaking into the city, but were slaughtered in the streets. Ivar installed a puppet king, and within a decade, York had become the capital of the Viking kingdom of Jórvík. The transition was swift and total. Viking smiths worked beside Anglo-Saxon craftsmen in Coppergate. Norse traders brought silver from the Baltic, furs from Scandinavia, amber from the eastern seas. The city's street plan, narrow, organic, serpentine, dates to this period. The Vikings did not destroy Eoforwic. They transformed it into the commercial hub of the Irish Sea trading network, a polyglot city where Old Norse and Old English mingled in the markets and the shipyards along the Ouse. For 80 years, York was a Viking city. The kings of Jórvík ruled from a hall near the old Roman headquarters, minting coins stamped with ravens and hammers, presiding over a population that may have reached 15,000 by the early 10th century. The most famous of these kings was Erik Bloodaxe, the exiled Norwegian prince who seized York in 947 and again in 952. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls him a tyrant. The sagas call him a hero. He ruled for 2 years before dying in battle at Stainmoor in 954, and with his death, the Viking kingdom ended. King Edred of Wessex absorbed Northumbria into a unified England. But Viking York did not vanish. The city's economy had been reoriented towards Scandinavia and Ireland, and that commercial network persisted. Excavations at Coppergate, the street of the cupmakers, have revealed a dense warren of Viking-age workshops. Archaeologists found leather shoes, antler combs, wooden bowls, iron knives, and thousands of fragments of imported pottery. One house, designated 16 to 22 Coppergate, contained the remains of a wood-turner's workshop, complete with a lathe, chisels, and half-finished cups. The timbers were preserved in oxygen-free clay. Dendrochronology dates the building's construction to 930–935. We know the wood-turner worked there for at least 2 decades. We know he imported amber from the Baltic and soapstone from Norway. We know he lived through the reigns of 4 different kings: Viking, Anglo-Saxon, Viking again, then Wessex. The Viking legacy saturated York's culture. The street names are Norse: Micklegate, Great Street; Coppergate, Cupmakers Street; Skeldergate, Shieldmakers Street. The city's dialect retained Norse vocabulary for centuries, and the city's layout, the tight, irregular lanes radiating from the Ouse, reflects Viking urbanism, not Roman planning. When the Normans arrived in 1066, they found a city that still looked, sounded, and smelled like Scandinavia. William the Conqueror's conquest of northern England was brutal. In 1068, York rebelled. William marched north, built 2 motte and bailey castles, one on either side of the Ouse, and installed a Norman garrison. The next year, a Danish fleet sailed up the Humber in support of Edgar the Aetheling, and York's English population massacred the Norman garrison. William's response was genocidal. In the winter of 1069–70, he unleashed the harrying of the North, a scorched earth campaign that depopulated Yorkshire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that William's soldiers burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and salted fields from the Humber to the Tees. 16 years later, Domesday Book recorded vast tracts of northern England as waste. York's population collapsed to perhaps 3,000. Yet the city recovered, and recovery came through the church. In 1070, Thomas of Bayeux became the first Norman Archbishop of York. He rebuilt the cathedral, a larger, grander structure in the Norman Romanesque style. He asserted York's claim to primacy over the Scottish Church, sparking a jurisdictional war with Canterbury that would simmer for centuries. By 1100, York had regained its status as England's second city. The Ouse carried wool downstream from the Yorkshire Dales to the port of Hull and the Flemish markets beyond. Merchants built stone houses along Stonegate and Petergate. The city's Jewish community, invited by William Rufus to finance the wool trade, established a synagogue near Coney Street. York had become a Norman city, but the bones of Jórvík remained beneath every street. On the morning of March 16, 1190, York's Jewish community barricaded themselves inside Clifford's Tower, the wooden keep atop the royal castle's motte. A mob led by Richard Malabis and local debtors besieged the tower, demanding the Jews emerge and accept baptism. When the tower caught fire, most of the 150 Jews inside chose suicide over forced conversion. The few who surrendered were killed. It was the worst anti-Jewish massacre in medieval England, and it stained York's reputation for generations. The Jewish community never fully recovered. By 1290, when Edward I expelled all Jews from England, York's synagogue had been converted into a church. But the 13th century was also the age of York's greatest architectural triumph. In 1220, Archbishop Walter de Grey laid the foundation stone for a new cathedral, a Gothic edifice to replace Thomas of Bayeux's Norman structure. The construction would consume 2.5 centuries. The south transept rose first, completed by 1241, its lancet windows soaring 70 feet. The north transept followed, featuring the Five Sisters window, 5 lancets filled with geometric griselle glass from the 1250s, each 53 feet tall. The chapter house, an octagonal wonder with a wooden vault unsupported by any central column, was finished in 1296. The nave took another century. The choir and east end, the cathedral's climax, with the great east window containing the largest expanse of medieval stained glass in Britain, was not completed until 1408. York Minster became the physical embodiment of York's wealth and power. The archbishops of York were second only to Canterbury in England's ecclesiastical hierarchy, and they ruled the city as temporal lords. They maintained palaces in York and at Bishopthorpe. They commanded armies. Archbishop William Melton personally led York's militia to disaster at the Battle of Myton in 1319, when Scottish raiders slaughtered 300 clerics and citizens. The debacle was called the Chapter of Myton, a bitter joke about the number of churchmen killed. Meanwhile, York's secular economy flourished. The city's guilds, the mercers, drapers, goldsmiths, butchers and bakers regulated trade and dominated civic life. The York Mystery Plays, a cycle of 48 biblical pageants performed by the guilds on the Feast of Corpus Christi, began in the 1370s and continued for 2 centuries. The plays were staged on wagons rolled through the streets, each guild responsible for one episode. The shipwrights performed the building of the Ark, the goldsmiths, the adoration of the Magi, the bakers, the Last Supper. At its medieval peak, York's population reached 15,000 again, still smaller than London, but the uncontested capital of the north. The city's defences reflected this prosperity. York's medieval walls, built atop the Roman foundations, stretched nearly 3 miles in a rough rectangle enclosing the old fortress and the medieval suburbs. 4 great gates, the bars, controlled access: Bootham Bar to the northwest, Monk Bar to the northeast, Walmgate Bar to the southeast, Micklegate Bar to the southwest. Micklegate Bar became the stage for royal pageantry and royal brutality. Kings entering York from the south processed through Micklegate in ceremony, and the severed heads of traitors were impaled on spikes above the gate as warnings. After the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, the head of Richard, Duke of York, adorned with a paper crown, was displayed above Micklegate Bar for months. In 1536, the religious houses that had dominated York for centuries began to disappear. Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries stripped the city of St. Mary's Abbey, the wealthiest Benedictine house in northern England, and more than a dozen smaller foundations. The abbey's abbot, William Thornton, surrendered the property without resistance. The king's commissioners catalogued the treasures, gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, reliquaries, and shipped them to London. The abbey church was demolished for building stone. Within a decade, the ruins were quarries. The dissolution triggered the Pilgrimage of Grace, the largest rebellion of Henry's reign. In October 1536, Robert Asker, a Yorkshire lawyer, led 30,000 men in a protest march demanding the restoration of the monasteries and the removal of Thomas Cromwell. The rebels occupied York without a fight. Aske held court in the King's Manor, negotiating with the Duke of Norfolk, who promised royal pardons and a parliament to address grievances. It was a lie. When the rebels dispersed, Henry ordered mass executions. Aske was hanged in chains from the walls of York Castle in July 1537. His body was left to rot as a warning. York survived the Reformation diminished. The city's population stagnated at around 12,000. The wool trade declined as the West Riding textile towns rose. The archbishops still commanded prestige, but their temporal power waned. The city became a backwater, prosperous, conservative, loyal to the crown. That loyalty was tested in the 1640s. When the English Civil War began in 1642, York declared for King Charles III. The city became the royalist capital of the north. Charles established his court in the King's Manor, the former abbot's lodging of St. Mary's Abbey. His queen, Henrietta Maria, held assemblies in the medieval Guildhall. For 2 years, York functioned as an alternative capital, minting coins, raising regiments, and hosting the King's Parliament. Then the parliamentarians came. In April 1644, the Scots Covenanter army under Alexander Leslie besieged York. By June, the Eastern Association forces under the Earl of Manchester and the English parliamentarians under Lord Fairfax had joined the siege. 25,000 men surrounded the city. Inside, the royalist garrison under the Marquis of Newcastle numbered 7,000. The siege lasted 11 weeks. The besiegers dug trenches, erected artillery batteries, and bombarded the walls. St. Mary's Tower collapsed under cannon fire. The defenders held. On July 1st, Prince Rupert of the Rhine marched a royalist relief army of 18,000 men to York from the northwest, scattering the besiegers. The next day, Rupert met the combined parliamentarian Scottish forces at Marston Moor, 7 miles west of the city. It was the largest battle of the Civil War. The royalists were annihilated. Rupert fled. Newcastle sailed into exile. On July 16, 1644, York surrendered to Sir Thomas Fairfax. The parliamentarians imposed a fine of £12,000 on the city, dismantled the fortifications, and garrisoned the castle. York's days as a military stronghold were over. The city that emerged from the Civil War was smaller, poorer, and chastened. But the 18th century brought revival through an unexpected source: aristocratic leisure. York reinvented itself as a social capital for the northern gentry. During the winter season, the great landholding families of Yorkshire, the Howards, the Wentworths, the Fanes, descended on York for assemblies, theatre, and horse racing. The York Assembly Rooms, designed by the Earl of Burlington and completed in 1732, became the architectural jewel of Georgian York, a Palladian palace for balls and concerts. The city's economy shifted from wool to services. Confectioners, wig makers, dancing masters, and music teachers opened shops along Stonegate and Blake Street. York's population climbed back towards 16,000 by 1800. The Minster's west towers, left incomplete since the 15th century, were finally topped with Gothic revival pinnacles in the 1470s design. The city had become a museum of its own past, a living exhibition of Roman walls, medieval gates, and half-timbered Tudor buildings now repurposed as coaching inns. Then the railway arrived and changed everything. George Hudson, the railway king, transformed York into the railway hub of northern England. Hudson was a York draper who made a fortune speculating on railway shares in the 1830s and 1840s. He served as Lord Mayor of York 3 times and personally financed the construction of the York and North Midland Railway. which linked York to London in 1839. By 1850, York was the junction of 5 major rail lines. Hudson built a massive railway station just outside the city walls, a curving iron and glass train shed that could accommodate a dozen platforms. The station opened in 1877 and remains one of Britain's busiest. The railway brought industry. The North Eastern Railway established its headquarters in York in 1854, employing 5,000 workers in the locomotive works and carriage sheds near the station. Rowntree's chocolate factory, founded by Joseph Rowntree in 1862, grew into one of York's largest employers, producing cocoa, pastilles, and the Kit Kat bar. Terry's chocolate factory opened nearby. By 1900, York's population had surged to 75,000. The medieval city within the walls became an island of antiquity, surrounded by Victorian suburbs, red brick terraces, nonconformist chapels, and the towering chimneys of the chocolate works. The 20th century tested York once more. On the night of April 29, 1942, German bombers attacked the city in the Baedeker Blitz, a retaliatory raid targeting historic English cities. 92 civilians died. The Guildhall was gutted by fire, but York Minster survived, and the medieval street plan survived, and the walls survived. Walk the walls of York today, and you are walking on 2,000 years. The limestone blocks at the base are Roman, quarried in the 2nd century. The medieval crenellations above were raised in the 14th century. The Victorian lampposts were installed in 1880. Every arch, every gate, every stone records a layer of history. Legionaries on patrol, Viking smiths at their forges, medieval guilds processing to the Minster, royalist musketeers scanning the horizon for Cromwell's men. York never became England's capital, but it never needed to. It survived because it refused to choose between past and future. The Minster still holds services in a building begun in 1220. The railway station still dispatches trains from platforms laid in 1877. The Shambles, the narrow medieval butcher's lane, now sells fudge to tourists from Shanghai and Sao Paulo. The city within the walls is a palimpsest, each century writing over the last without erasing what came before. 4 million visitors walk these streets each year, photographing the same views the Roman sentries saw, the same river the Vikings sailed, the same towers the parliamentarians besieged. They come because York is England in miniature, conquest and faith, commerce and war, decline and reinvention. The walls remain. The city endures.